Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our online service today. It is absolutely brilliant to have you with us. I want to start, as usual, with a psalm that encourages us to come and to worship God. Be joyful in the Lord, all you lands. Serve the Lord with gladness, and come before his presence with a song. Know this, the Lord himself is God. He himself has made us, and we are his. We are the people, the sheep of his pasture. So enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and call upon his name. For the Lord is good. His mercy is everlasting, and his faithfulness endures from age to age. So let's pray together, shall we? And the words are here on the screen, and if you'd like to join in with the words in bold, then that would be great. Come to worship. Come and give God all you are. Put your hearts into it. Make up your minds to give him the best. With all our hearts we worship. Open up your souls and spirits. Let his spirit move and touch you. With all our souls we worship. Don't switch off your brains. Worship him thoughtfully and intelligently. With all our minds we worship. Put your back into it. Never tire of exalting God and showing others you mean it. With all our strength we worship. All creation praises God. Everything I am comes to give him the best I can. Amen. So this is week 3 of our journey in Joshua, and we'll be breaking off after this week from Joshua as we enter the season of Advent. But today I just want to share a short reading from Joshua chapter 5. And if you remember last week, we got to that point in the story where the people of Israel had come up to the river and they needed a miracle to be able to get across and to actually enter now into the land that God had promised to them. And we thought a little bit about the faith that was required in order to be able to do that. And today we're at that point where it's just before the battle, the very first big battle that they're going to face, the battle to take the city of Jericho. And this is just a short reading, and it's a short encounter between Joshua and a heavenly being. And I'll say a little bit more about that a little bit later on. So the reading is Joshua chapter 5, starting at verse 13 and reading through to the end of verse 15. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," the man replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell down and fell on the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. We're going to sing again, and then a little bit later on I just want to share a few thoughts about that reading. So this was a short but interesting reading in the midst, or rather as a prelude to the big story that most people who've attended Sunday school would know, the whole Battle of Jericho that's about to happen. And this is just that little lull before the battle when Joshua encounters this heavenly being. Now, I say heavenly being because theologians are really a bit split about exactly who this commander of the Lord's army actually is. And we don't need to worry too much about his identity because we're not really told. But some theologians think actually this was a pre-incarnate Jesus. This was one of a theophany, in other words, an appearance of God to humans. And this one obviously before Jesus eventually would be born many hundreds of years later. But also there's the distinct possibility that this is just an incredibly important angelic being who appears as a messenger from God with something for Joshua. And it was basically the battle plan about how to take Jericho. And I don't really want to get into that. That's a well-known story, and I guess most people who've been anywhere near a Sunday school will have heard it in the past. But I just want to concentrate on that little phrase that this heavenly being tells Joshua during this encounter, and he says simply this. Look, he tells him who he is, and then Joshua falls face down to the ground in reverence and awe and asks, well, what have you come to tell me? And the first thing that the angel says is, look, take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy. Now that's a really interesting start to a conversation. It's certainly not the kind of conversation that you or I would be most used to having. But actually this conversation mirrors a conversation that occurred between Joshua's predecessor, Moses, and God. You may remember that when Moses was out in the desert, before he went to talk to Pharaoh and persuade him eventually to let the children of Israel go so that they could leave Egypt and go start their journey towards the promised land, he had this encounter with a burning bush. And it was the voice of God, and scripture tells us quite clearly in that instance that it was the voice of God speaking. And the voice says, Moses, take off your shoes, because the place where you're standing is holy ground. And it is then that Moses gets the commission, indeed the command, to go and start the work that God was calling him to. And here we are many years later with Moses' successor, Joshua, who has a similar encounter. This time it's not with a voice, it's not with a burning bush, but with a being obviously of incredible power and presence, who stood with a sword in his hand. And Joshua sees and hears who this being is and absolutely freaks out and falls down in worship, certainly in reverence before this being. And that's when the being says, take off your shoes, for the place where you are is holy. It's interesting that these accounts, both for Moses and Joshua, happen in the context of potentially big changes. Big changes. For Moses, it happened at the start of his commission. He was being told by God, look, I want you to go back to Pharaoh and I want you to tell him to let my people go. It was at the start of a commission for God's people to leave the slavery and oppression of Egypt and to begin to move in to the promise of God's provision of a new land and a new way of being. For Joshua, it happened, this account happens, if you read the first verses of chapter 5, this happens just after God has told the people, look, you've come to the end of your wanderings in the wilderness, you're about to enter the promised land, but this has taken you so long that many of you have forgotten some of the ancient customs and rites that really as my people you should practice, one of which being circumcision. as a sign of being set apart and being dedicated to God. So God tells the people of Israel, before you go into this, before you start battle, before we go any further, you need to undertake that ceremony of circumcision in order to signify your wholehearted commitment and obedience to me. And it was after that that Joshua gets this angelic visitation. And so this removing of shoes, this standing on holy ground, occurs at times of massive transition, from which kind of really talk about that movement of God's people from oppression and slavery, from wandering in a wilderness to moving into God's provision and God's promises. There was that sense of reverence and awe that God was at work. God was doing something incredibly significant. And in order to be able to enter into that, the people of God had to make a real committed decision to follow him. And it was not going to be easy. It was really not going to be easy. The wanderings through the wilderness with Moses were anything but easy, and they had many, many trials. They made it much harder for themselves, of course, through disobedience and through wandering, and they could have made that journey in a fraction of the time that it took them, but in the end it takes them nearly 40 years to get through the wilderness, and that was never God's original plan. But however long it was going to take them, it was not going to be easy. But the people of God seemed to make it even harder for themselves. I wonder whether that speaks to us today, how we often make our walk with God so much harder than it really does need to be. And that's often through our own deliberate disobedience, through our foolishness, through our lack of understanding of what God really wants. But in any case, God eventually brings them to the position where they're ready now to begin to enter into everything that he has promised to them. And as a mark of that, they have this encounter with this holy place where Joshua and Moses had to remove their shoes and encounter that holiness. And so maybe that removing of shoes in the midst of those significant events just symbolize the importance of preparation and recognizing the holiness of the phrases that God is taking us through, and that sense of beginning to recommit ourselves to that part of the journey. But also that sense of coming home. In both cases, both Moses and Joshua, that removing of shoes happened in a sense of being committed to starting that journey. Moses had to go back to Pharaoh and to begin that journey towards the promised land, and how here with Joshua they're about to actually enter that promised land and to begin to occupy the things that God had always planned for them to have and to do. And of course, that's an incredibly difficult story when it continues, and there are so many battles and so many things that actually it's really hard for us to get our head round. And maybe that's a subject for another day. But certainly, this is a really significant and difficult time. But it is a time when there's a sense in which the people of God are coming home. They're coming home to the promises. They're coming home to a fulfillment of what God had always called them to be, and the place that God had always intended them to have. And so therefore, I wonder whether or not there's also that sense that this removing of your shoes prior to these events is that sense of coming home. But also, I'm reminded as I talk about this that certainly Val, when she comes home, the very first thing she does is to take her shoes off. Before she takes her coat off, before she does anything really, she walks through the door and kicks her shoes off. It's a sign of, I'm home. I'm home and I want to get comfy. I'm home and I want to make myself very much at home. And of course, it's not an unusual thing for people to do. You come through the door and you would remove your shoes. Certainly, partly because it's practical, because you don't want to tread in to your home many of the things that perhaps you've been walking in whilst you were outside. And so you kick your shoes off and you might put your slippers on. Val, not so much. She likes to wander around in bare feet. But there's that sense of removing your shoes because you have come home. And I remember as a kid, we were going around playing in each other's, as friends, we'd go around and play in each other's houses as often you did. And one day we went to a friend's house, and his parents had obviously just had new carpets fitted. And they weren't too keen about having a bunch of kids running around in their shoes. So they said, hang on a minute, you lot, before you go in, just take your shoes off and leave them by the door. And so people started to do that. There were a small bunch of us. But unfortunately, I'd remembered as I was doing this, oh crumbs, I've got holes in my socks. I've got holes in my socks. I don't know why I'd put on socks with holes in. I don't know why I got socks with holes in particular. Can't remember that. But I knew that I got socks with a hole in, and that my toes would be pointing out of a couple of these holes. So I quickly made an excuse and said, oh, I've got to run home for something first, and then hastily beat a retreat down the road back to my house to find a pair of socks that didn't have any holes in. Changed my socks, came back, and then could take my shoes off and go in and play with my friends. And that's, for me, that's kind of one of those little instances that has kind of stayed with me, really. But it does say something about this, that the lack of wanting to tread in to the home that had just had these nice new carpets fitted, the rubbish that was on our shoes from being outside playing, and that's important. And again, just this symbolic journey that removing your shoes just says something about putting to one side, leaving behind the things that you'd been treading in all day as you come in to the presence of God, and as you come into the purposes and plans of God for you. This was now a holy place, and I want to say a little bit more about that in a moment, but this was now going to be a special place, and neither Moses nor Joshua were to bring in on their feet, as it were, symbolically bring in with them the things that they'd been symbolically treading in all this time, be it disobedience, be it just not following God, really. But to recognise the holiness of this encounter, and to begin to receive what God was going to say, and then begin to kind of go out of that holy space into that God had promised. So there's that about not treading in the things that you'd started, you'd been treading in the whole day. Also that sense of vulnerability. That vulnerability I felt when I realised, oh dear, I've got holes in my socks. I didn't want my friends to see that I'd got holes in my socks, because, group of boys, that would have occasioned a fair amount of name calling and fun, and frankly I felt embarrassed. Obviously not embarrassed enough to make sure I didn't put holy socks on in the morning, but anyway, that's another thing. So I felt embarrassed, and so I had to run home and change my socks. It was okay to be in my own house with holy socks, but not somebody else's. So taking my shoes off was a sign of being much more vulnerable. And I believe that's partly the symbolic nature of this, that when both Moses and Joshua come into that holy space, they are vulnerable. They have to take their shoes off as a sign of vulnerability. They're open to what God is saying. They're open to what God is wanting to do. There's no division between them and the space that God occupies, that is now holy. Holy, I believe, not because the ground was somehow miraculously made holy. It wasn't the place, it was the presence that made the space holy. It wasn't the place, it was the presence that made the space holy. And part of marking that was when you come into that holy space, you are obviously open and vulnerable, because that holy space begins to expose us in ways that perhaps, like me with my holy socks, we would find uncomfortable. But notice, when both Moses and Joshua come into that space, they didn't receive condemnation. They didn't receive a telling off. They didn't encounter a God with a big stick in his hand ready to beat them up and ready to point out all of their mistakes. For all of their openness and vulnerability, they come to a God who gives them words of promise, who gives them words of encouragement, who gives them words of strength, who gives them words of plans and purposes. And so for both Moses and Joshua, they take off their shoes, they enter the holy space, and they receive not condemnation, but they receive promise, and they receive strength, and they receive things that they're going to need going forward. And that's important, because often we think, I'm not good enough to come into God's presence. And often I know I often will feel like this. I know that I've really stuffed up, and I do it far more than I should. And I'll feel like I really don't want to pray, and I somehow I just don't want to come. Reading my Bible's okay, funnily enough. I can read my Bible, but prayer, no. I don't want to pray. When I instinctively I feel, I'm not right. I'm not, But at those times, I believe God says, look, take your shoes off, come into my presence. I'm not going to beat you up. I've got words of promise. I've got words of encouragement. You've probably already beaten yourself up enough. You know what you did, and you know you shouldn't do it, but that's okay. Let's go forward. I can give you the strength. I can give you what you need so that you don't do that again, as long as you're obedient to me. And so being open and vulnerable in God's presence shouldn't be something that we should fear, because he absolutely knows us. He really loves us. And he wants us to come, and he wants us to take our shoes off in reverence, but also as a sign of we're coming home. We're coming home to the God who loves us and who always planned for us to be in his presence. And that kind of brings me to the final point, really, is that, as I said, this place was not, the burning bush was not holy because somehow the ground had become holy. This encounter with the commander of the armies of the Lord happened in the desert. There was nothing special about the ground, I believe. But actually, it was the presence of God with Moses, or the presence of this angelic being or heavenly messenger with Joshua, that made that space holy. It wasn't the place, it was the presence that made it holy. And of course, we're just about to enter the period of Advent. Next Sunday, we start Advent. And it's a lovely, wonderful time of year. It's a time of hope. It's a time of expectation. It's a time of looking forward. Why? Because we remember two things. First of all, we remember the coming of Jesus, our Emmanuel, God with us. God with us. And Advent in particular is about remembering that God will come again. That as Jesus has come once as a baby, so he will come again as a king to rule and to reign, finally creating new heavens and a new earth. And it's interesting, for Moses and Joshua, they had to encounter this special presence at certain times. But for us, God has come. Emmanuel, Jesus is with us. His presence is with us. And if we remember that, that should make a difference to us. Remember, for both Moses and for Joshua, for Mary, for Martha, for pretty much anybody who encounters an angelic presence, the first thing they do is hit the floor. The second thing they do is acknowledge how imperfect they are, before they get the do not worry, do not fear, be strong, stand up, I've got good news for you. And that's what we celebrate, is that they had to go into a special place to receive that. It was a special time, but now we have God with us. We have God with us. His presence is with us. Therefore, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, it's a holy place. It's a holy place because it's not the place, it's the presence. And as we carry that presence with us, then we carry that holiness with us. And that's both a challenge, but it's also an incredible promise that God is with us. And we walk around inhabiting that holy space. And of course, that's the thing that's picked up in the New Testament, that we are called to be a holy people, not because there's anything particularly holy or righteous about us, but we're called to be holy because we recognize that we have the Holy One with us. We have the Holy One with us. We have Emmanuel, God with us. Anyway, much more about that over the coming weeks as we look forward to celebrating the birth of Jesus, and beyond that, looking forward to that second coming of the King. So this week, what do we take away from this? I think what we take away from this is to recognise that yes, God's presence is with us, but that presence transforms. It is a presence that we need to be reverent in. We need to be careful of, and we need to guard, not fearfully, but we need to value it. We need to reverence it. We need to value the fact that God is with us. And if we remember that, that should change so much of what we do. It should change so much of what we say. It should change how we are, I think, in many ways. And that's a really important thing. And that we remember as we come into that presence, as we inhabit this holy presence, that yes, we have, by virtue of our decision to follow God, put away the things that we once walked in. But actually that's the thing that we need to do daily. We need to do daily, because every now and then we step in something we really shouldn't. And so it's important for us to live a life where we are mindful and we put to one side those things that really are just not helpful for us as we walk around in this holy presence that God gives us. And of course, remembering that we are called to be at home in that presence. One day we will inhabit that holy presence fully, absolutely fully, wonderfully well. At the moment, it's in part. It's fragmentary. It's difficult for us. One day it won't be like that. And then, of course, it's an incredible promise for us that whatever situation we find ourselves going into, we don't go into it alone, but we have that presence, and we have God's provision and God's resources to meet those situations. So wherever we find ourselves this week, remembering that God is with us, remembering that his holy presence is there, and that in his presence there are often words of comfort and of strength and of love. So I think that's probably what I want to share with you this week. We're going to sing a song again now that celebrates that. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Hopefully, next week will be our last week in lockdown, and that after that we can meet together. Of course, we're all waiting on the government's rules and how they might or might not change after lockdown. And I'm really looking forward to celebrating again the first coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and looking forward to Christmas. And if you can join us at any point, please feel free to do so, because we would absolutely love to see you and to share the good news of God with us as we do that. So have a good week.
May the grace of Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Spirit be with us. May the grace of Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Spirit be with us. The Lord bless us and keep us, His face shine upon us, His grace and His peace rest on grace of Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Spirit be with us.